But I do need to thank our sponsors once again. This would not be possible without the Templeton Foundations. They have taken us on, as I mentioned previously, and we're grateful for their support. Compass Point is also very generous to us. We have patrons, Donald Tomlinson, Go Ahead Biscuits, Arizona Drinks, supporters in J.S. Johnson and Majestic Tours, and donors, Bahamas First. Of course, as I said, without you and Dr. Ebeling, it still wouldn't be possible, so we all come together as a team, and we hope you enjoy the 2 and a bit lectures today, the 2 lectures and the wrap-up today with Dr. Ebeling. Thanks again, and without further ado, here he is.
Okay, thank you. Well, for those who have been here the last day or two, I want to thank you for returning. And for those of you here for the first time, thank you for being here on a Saturday. You know, it's a beautiful day out there. Let's forget the lecture. Let's go to the beach. No, oh no, I don't think some people would be too happy with that. Okay, but I'm going to be basically doing 2 full presentations this morning and then a final brief sort of wrap-up talk on a different sort of enveloping theme. But the first presentation, as you can see from the PowerPoint here, is being moral stewards of the world, market solutions to our environmental problems. And for us to understand this, let me suggest that the best way to do so is in the concept of externalities. Externalities, as I say, are spillover effects on others from someone's actions. Externalities are defined as second or third party effects resulting from the actions of others for which the affected person has not been compensated if the externality is negative, that is considered by the affected person as undesirable or harmful, or the affected person has not paid a price if the externality is positive, that is considered by the affected person as desirable or enjoyable. Now, most externalities are thought about in the negative way, like pollution, for instance. So let me take a moment to sort of explain, well, what's a positive externality? My wife and I used to live in a place in Michigan called Hillsdale. And we were there because there's a college called Hillsdale College where I was for many years a professor, and we had a house. And shortly after we moved in, my wife decided that she wanted to brighten up the grounds. She was going to do some gardening, put in a flower bed, some roses, other things in the front and on the side of the house, all of which obviously could be seen from the sidewalk in front of the house. So of course that meant that the grass or the bushes that basically had died that were there had to be dug up. We had to lay new fertilizer and other soil, potting soil, and then purchase the plants that we were going to be putting in. And then you have to lay them out, and you have to water them, and you have to tend them out like while they're taking root. And then, of course, there's this no regular maintenance of watering it, keeping animals away that would eat them, and these all things had to be done. Obviously, labor time, human effort, which basically means that she did the planting, but I had to dig the holes. It's big and strong, I'm digging the holes in the ground. And then obviously the various fertilizers and the watering. So you have resources, you have monetary expenditure for the inputs, and you have labor time and labor effort. We incurred all of that. And when it was done, my wife had a very good eye for what she wanted and how it would look. And I have to say that when it was done, and obviously the plants had taken root and were blossoming, the front and the side of the house, again, all of which could be seen from the sidewalk, was very attractive. Now, people could walk by our house. We didn't have a fence. People could walk by our house, and if they enjoyed flowers and roses and so on, they could walk there every day or several times a day and aesthetically enjoy what we had done, but for which, even though they got a positive benefit from, right, an aesthetic enjoyment, if you like that type of thing, for which they paid nothing, right? They didn't pay for it. They're having the benefit, but we incurred all of the expense. That would be a positive externality, where others incur the effort, the time, the money expenses to do something and to provide something, but which you can receive a positive gain, pleasure, or enjoyment from, but for which you don't contribute to cover the expenses of making it possible. Okay, that's a positive externality. Negative externalities are the ones that are more generally thought of. Most externalities, problems arise from, well, examples of negative externalities would be air or water pollution, or noise pollution. For instance, loud music from a neighbor's house in the middle of the night when you were trying to sleep. A neighbor throwing his garbage into your side of the backyard, so to speak. That would be a negative externality. But I would want to argue, and I would say that most economists generally accept this, is that most externality problems arise from either a lack of clearly defined property rights or a failure to effectively enforce property rights. When property rights are clearly defined and enforced, most economists agree that the externality can be, and often is, internalized. That is included in the decisions and agreements among the people themselves to solve any problem that is having a negative effect on one due to the actions of another. The property owner whose property is being negatively affected by the actions of someone else can legally insist that the person causing this negative effect has to either A, stop his actions that are causing the negative effect on the property owner and clean up any and all damages to his property, or B, pay the affected person a price sufficient to compensate for this negative effect so the polluter can continue his actions. Okay? Now, what does that mean? Well, this idea of the market having avenues or ways to internalize, that is, the agents themselves finding ways to agree upon solving this externality problem, was particularly developed by an economist named Ronald Coase. He won the Nobel Prize in 1991. As you can see that he only recently died, 2013. And if you look at his age, he was 103 years old. He was 103 years old. And amazingly, about a year before he died, he published his last book. So at 102, I just hope I'm alive, drooling, wearing adult Pampers at 102. But he actually published, he co-authored it, but he published his last book at 102 years old about economic development in China. But anyway, he argued in a famous article called The Problem of Social Cost that as long as property rights exist and the transaction costs of negotiation are not excessively expensive, negative externalities are likely to always be internalized regardless of how the property rights are defined or enforced. There's a very famous article, but I found that the best brief summary of it was not by himself, but by this other economist, Donald Boudreaux. He's an economist at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, in actually a piece that he wrote for an encyclopedia of economics, which is, Coase's idea is called the Coase theorem. And Boudreaux asks us to look upon it this way. A manufacturer earns a net profit of $1,000 a month. However, this manufacturer's production process generates soot that falls on a nearby home, resulting in monthly damages to that homeowner of $700. To be rid of the pollution, the homeowner sues the manufacturer, seeking an injunction forcing the factory to stop polluting. If the household can enjoin, that is, legally stop the manufacturer from polluting, the manufacturer will offer the homeowner some amount between $700 and $1,000 for the right to pollute. Clearly, the homeowner will find any such offer to be advantageous, since this is mutually beneficial. This is a mutually beneficial trading possibility. Well, why is that the case? Well, if he makes this product, the manufacturer can make $1,000. Okay, and let us suppose that that's $1,000 of net gain over all other expenses. So that's $1,000 of profit, for instance. Now, his actions are causing $700 of damages due to the soot coming out of this chimney stack and smokestack and hitting the neighbor of $700. So he could offer to the neighbor $700 to cover the cleanup costs, or even more than that, right? He could say, I'll pay you $800 or $850. And why would it be advantageous for the manufacturer to do that? Because even by doing that, he still earns a net profit, which he would not have at all if he had to stop producing. In other words, having a net profit of $300 or even $250 is better than having a net profit of zero, right? Now, would it be advantageous for the neighbor to take this offer? And the answer to this would be yes as well. I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture, I think I did, in passing, this kind of example, is that let's suppose my neighbor is throwing his garbage over the backyard fence into my yard. And I say, what are you doing this? This is my backyard, you can't do this. But first of all, it smells, it's not aesthetically attractive, and if I don't want to leave it there, I have to pay someone else to haul it away, and that's expensive. And let's suppose my neighbor asks me, well, how much would it cost to have you haul away my garbage that I'm throwing into your yard? And I say, well, the company says that they can haul it away for $200 every month. And then my neighbor says, well, to allow me to keep throwing garbage into your yard, I'll pay you $400 or $500. Well, surely we could imagine that some people would say, well, look here, yeah, it's a nuisance, but I pay someone $200 to haul it away each month, and then he's going to give me an extra $200 or $300 on top of that as a net gain for myself. We could easily imagine that someone, I'm not saying everybody, but some people would say, that's a good deal. Now, what about the opposite case? Coase and Boudreau, explaining Coase's argument, says, if the court dismisses the case, then the factory continues to produce and to pollute as before. Suppose that the manufacturer can purchase a scrubber for his smokestack that will completely eliminate the soot discharge. If the court dismisses the homeowner's lawsuit, the homeowner will offer to purchase a $400 a month scrubber for the manufacturer, an offer that in principle the manufacturer has no incentive to reject. In this case, the manufacturer's monthly net profits remain $1,000 and the soot emission is eradicated. And the homeowner spends $400 a month to buy this scrubber to avoid a loss of $700 per month. And in this case, the court says no. The manufacturer can continue to pollute your property with his smokestack. And then you're stuck with a $700 a month cleanup cost. But what Coase and Boudreau, in his example of Coase's idea, is saying is that suppose that, in fact, you could buy a scrubber and offer to the manufacturer to install it in his factory. And with that $400 scrubber, there'll be no pollution affecting your neighboring property. Well, given that the court has said that the manufacturer can pollute, so you're stuck with that, would you rather have a $400 a month cost or a $700 a month cost? Well, you minimize the expense, right? It's cheaper to you to have the manufacturer not pollute, and it only costs you $400, than for him to pollute and you have $700 of course, right? You're minimizing your expense, given that the court has said it's your problem, not the other guy's. In this case, regardless of how the property rights are delineated, the polluter cannot pollute the neighbor's property, or the neighbor can pollute the neighbor's, the factory can pollute the neighbor's property. Either way, in this case, we can imagine situations in which there can be mutual gains from trade to minimize the cost to both of them, so each can feel that given the property decision, they can still walk away at least more satisfied than if they hadn't transacted in this way. This can be the logic of this in many cases. So that one can argue is that many of the problems we have is the fact that property rights have not been defined or delineated. Let me sort of give just a variation of this. Now, what have I drawn here? The sort of, these squiggly lines, those are waves. This is a river. Okay? Remember, this is not an art class, so I don't want any art critics here. Okay? Everybody is a judge of art. Okay, so we have up here, upstream, right? We have upstream here a factory. Okay? And then there are people who are living downstream. Okay, and here are two homes downstream. And so this is this fellow's property line on that side of the river. This is this fellow's property line on that side of the river. The problem is this guy is throwing down pollutants into the river. And it destroys the quality, the quote, pristine quality of the river. It's no longer safe to swim in. It smells bad. It has had a negative effect on the life in the river. The fish can no longer be safely caught and eaten, or maybe it's killed a bunch of the fish. And obviously his actions are having negative effects on people downstream. If there are no property rights, if it sort of belongs to all of us, it in a sense belongs to none of us. And if that is the case, he can pollute this river and have negative effects on these people. And they have, in principle, no recourse since it's the common property of all. But what Coase is getting at is that let us suppose that we had property rights that extended into the middle of the river. Now, in the United States, there have been many cases in which people do have property rights to parts of rivers and lakes. For instance, years ago, my aunt and uncle had a summer home up in the mountains in a town in upstate New York. And their home was along a lake. But their property line ran out to the middle of the lake, as is all the other neighbors' properties that bordered on the lake. And nobody could do anything to the river, to the lake, that would have a negative effect on the neighbors, any more than if I just threw my garbage across the fence into your backyard. And if issues came up, they had to have their own little community property owners association to make decisions about what one might do that would have negative effect on the lake property of the neighbors. And that minimized the conflicts. Did it mean that everybody was always happy? Are people ever completely happy with anything, given that you live in a world with other people? Of course not. But it was a way to negotiate and minimize potential conflicts of, well, what I want to do with my property, might have an effect on your property. And that's what Coase is getting at here. And that therefore, many, if not most, of the problems with negative externalities, pollution, is the fact that property rights either do not exist, okay, or are not clearly enforced. In the case of my river example, to use the logic of Coase, if he's polluting downstream, but his downstream neighbors do have property claims into the river, then he can't just dump it, because that's the same thing as the garbage over the fence. So what is his recourse? Okay, they could say cease and desist. And then he can his costs are the following. He can either offer to pay them for the inconveniences of polluting the river downstream, or he has to figure out a way to introduce some type of a manufacturing device that will not generate the pollutants that are harming the quality of the river, or he has to figure out a way, if he can't devise a way to get rid of the pollutants in the manufacturing process, to have them trucked someplace else where he can dispose of them, or in the extreme, he just has to shut down. He has to just shut down, because you can't do things at the expense of other people's rights. But that would then internalize it. There are costs of doing business, and one of them is these negative effects of pollutants on neighbors. You either pay them compensation, or you devise a way not to pollute, or you don't do it anymore. And then many of these negative externalities are taken care of by making people bear costs to find answers to the problems. Sure.
So the theorem applies when property rights are not clearly defined.
The problem arises either when they do not exist, they're not clearly defined, or they're not fully enforced. Okay. Right.
If they are,
then the people negotiate. Exactly. Now, another related aspect of this is what's called the tragedy of the commons. When individual property rights do not exist, or land and or resources are the common property of all members of society, none of whom may be excluded or limited in his use of the commonly owned or accessed land or resource, it will tend to be overused and depleted up to and including the total consumption or exhaustion of this land or resource. What does this mean? Well, this concept, the tragedy of the commons, was coined and explained by a famous social scientist named Garrett Hardin. There's actually a picture of him back in an article with that title, The Tragedy of the Commons, back in 1968. And this is the logic he tried to explain of why these tragedies occur if property rights, individual private property rights, do not exist. The tragedy of the commons develops in this way. Picture a pasture open to all. It is to be expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons. As a rational being, each herdsman seeks to maximize his gain. Explicitly or implicitly, more or less consciously, he is asking himself, what is the utility, the benefit, the gain to me of adding one more animal to my herd? This utility has one negative and one positive component. The positive component is a function of the increment of one animal. Since the herdsman receives all the proceeds from the sale of an additional animal, the positive utility or gain or benefit to him is +1. The negative component is a function of the additional overgrazing created by one more animal on this common land. Since, however, the effects of overgrazing are shared by all the herdsmen, the negative utility for any particular decision-making herdsman is only a fraction of -1. Adding together the component partial utilities, the rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add one more animal to his herd, and another and another. But this is the conclusion reached by each and every rational herdsman sharing a commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit. In a world that is limited, there's only so much grazing land without ruining it by overgrazing cattle on it. Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. That is, the world belongs to all of us and to no one. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. Let me try to give a few examples of this. Okay, let us suppose that there are the three of you, right? The three of you. And you would like to drink an ice cream soda, right? A big ice cream soda. The problem is an ice cream soda costs $3 and each of you only has $1. So not to miss out on ice cream soda, you decide to pool your $1 together to have a total of 3 and you buy a big, ice cream soda. Now, since each of you have given equal contributions, each of you claims equal right to stick a straw and drink out of the glass of the ice cream soda. Now, let us suppose that you are the gulpy type, okay? You like to stick that straw in and go, you like to drink it quick and fast, okay? Gulper. You, on the other hand, you're the sipper type. You like to take a little sip, roll it in your mouth, savor the taste, make it last. Even rest a moment before you take the next little sip, right? You like to make it last. He wants it all gone quick. And you're just somewhere in the middle. Okay, somewhere in the middle. Now, given that each of you has equal access to the ice cream soda, you can't make him drink slower, and he can't make you, can't command you to drink faster or anything. Given Mr. Gulper here, how might that affect your behavior? How much sipping are you going to be able to do if he keeps gulping? It's going to be gone pretty quick. That's not very nice of you, okay? Okay, so now given that if he keeps gulping and it's going to be gone quick, how will that affect your behavior? You better start drinking a little faster than you want to. In other words, this resource is going to be used up, consumed, faster than at least 2 of the 3 of you would have preferred, right? The resource is exhausted faster than would otherwise be the case. Okay? That's an example of the tragedy of the commons. Let me give another example. A number of years ago, I was invited to give some lectures at a conference in the Fiji Islands in the South Pacific. Yay, it's beautiful. They have industrial strength mosquitoes that dive bomb in military formation. Human being at 6 o'clock, dive, dive. I mean, they just swamp down on you, evil mosquitoes. Anyway, so there were a group of us staying at a hotel on the north side of the main Fiji island. And the hotel food, to be honest, wasn't that great. I mean, it was a good hotel, but we were told there was a neighboring town that had a great Japanese restaurant. Why don't we go to it? So we all pile into a taxi and proceed to take a dirt road to the town from the hotel. And so about halfway there, the taxi stops on the road because a cow is going across the road and sort of stops in the middle of the road for a while. And this cow is emaciated. It looks like it's barely standing. You can see its ribs, you know, through the hide. And I asked the driver, whose cow is this? Well, what is this? He says, this cow belonged to people of Fiji, the Fiji island cow. I said, well, I understand the cow is, you know, the Fiji, but who owns it? No, belong to all people of Fiji. So in other words, it's a cow that belongs to everyone, but therefore, guess what? To no one. Now, who is going to incur the expense or the care to feed the cow so it's not looking malnourished, about to fall over from starvation, if it gets sick, to care for it, or injured, you know, for some medical? Nobody. Because why incur the benefit, excuse me, the cost? Why incur the cost when anybody can then have the benefit? If you feed the cow and it gives milk, anybody can come along and milk the cow. It's not your cow any more than another person's cow. That's another tragedy of the common. It's another tragedy of the common. Now, if there were property rights in these cows, and I assume that there are cows in Fiji that are privately owned and therefore don't look like that cow, but if there had been property rights in that cow or similar cows, then that cow wouldn't have been in that near starvation, emaciated state. Again, when it belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. And therefore, no one cares for it, preserving it, conserving it, the way they would in other circumstances. Let me give one more other historical example of this. In the 1860s and 1870s, they started building railroads across the continental United States, from the Mississippi area to California, okay? And so now they're building the railways, and people are starting to take those 19th century old railroads across the plains and the prairies and the Rocky Mountains. And sometimes the trains would have to stop along the way because these herds of American bison, buffalo, would go across the track. You know, the train just couldn't get through. So while you're waiting, people would open the passenger car windows and either with rifles or pistols just shoot the bison for sport. Now, why? Because you see, this was on, public land, right? There's public land. And who do the bison, the buffalo, belong to? Everybody belongs to the people of America. It's on public land, federal public land. It's all of our bison. And so people would just say, well, look here, I'm going to California. I'm going to settle there. I'm never going to come this way. And if I don't enjoy the sport of shooting at the bison through the passenger car window of the train, someone else will. And that's the thing is, if someone said, but sir, if you keep shooting and killing all of them, there won't be bison anymore. And the guy says, who cares? It's not my bison. And I'm going to California. The result was that in the middle of the 19th century, it was estimated that there were herds of American bison adding up to maybe up to a million head of these buffalo. The problem was by the 1890s, it was estimated that there was barely 10 or 20,000 left because of this overkilling. But again, it was like this, or the ice cream soda. If it belongs to everybody, it belongs to no one. Now, you can go to Florida and you can go to alligator farms, okay? And you can watch people wrestle alligators. Not something I personally would want to do, wrestle an alligator. And you can also buy alligator products. You can buy alligator boots, you can buy alligator purses, you can buy alligator belts. Why? Because alligators can be privately owned. And there are incentives to have an alligator farm, to take care of them, not to overuse them for one reason or another. Property rights solve this problem. Now, this inevitably occurs whenever a resource is scarce. There has to be some way to see that it is not consumed, used up, exhausted. The institution of property rights historically emerged among people when resources began to become scarce relative to the uses that members of the community had for them. The competing demands for their use, for consumption or production, by the members of society came into conflict with each other because the available quantity was no longer sufficient to satisfy all the demands. The competing demands for this now scarce resource threatened to deplete or completely use it up, as each individual in his own interest attempted to gain and use as much of it before others did so likewise. The emergence of private property rights in society established rules and rights about who had ownership and use of portions of the scarce resource. It also generated individual incentives to economize and efficiently use the resource, since any misuse or wasteful application left the owner with less in his possession or diminished its value, and with no right to use any other amount of it legally recognized to be owned by another without that other person's agreement in trade. This was explained a long time ago by a famous Austrian economist named Karl Menger. Human society and property have a joint economic origin, since both have as their ultimate reason for their existence the fact that goods exist whose available quantities are smaller than the requirements that men have for them. Property, therefore, like human economy, that is the economizing, careful use of resources in general, is not an arbitrary invention, but rather the only practically possible solution of the problem. As a result, it is impossible to abolish the institution of property without removing the causes that of necessity bring it about. That is, without simultaneously increasing the available quantities of all economic goods to such an extent that the requirements of all members of society can be met completely. And as we spoke about earlier, if you were here for one of the early lectures, the fact is you cannot escape from scarcity. Our time is scarce, our resources are scarce, our mental and physical labor capacities are scarce, the money that we earn and then wish to use to buy things is scarce. All of this means that we cannot escape from scarcity. The means are insufficient to serve all of our ends. And sometimes more than one person wants to use the same means for their individual respective ends. And how do we see that one doesn't use it all to such a point that it's not only no longer available to him, but to others as well? And property rights is a human institution that separates mine from thine, and by doing so creates motives and incentives for conservation and preservation and care. Well, this has been explained by another economist named Harold Dempsett in a famous article that he wrote called Toward a Theory of Property Rights. A primary function of property rights, Harold Dempsett said, is that of guiding incentives to achieve a greater internalizing, that is, taking into consideration externalities. By communal ownership, I shall mean a right which can be exercised by all members of the community. Communal ownership means that the community denies to the state or to the individual citizens the right to interfere with any person's exercise of communally owned rights. Right? That's like Garrett Hardin's example of the tragedy of the commons. Everybody has access to the grazing land, and nobody can exclude anyone because, quote, it belongs to all of us, unquote. Private ownership impels that the community recognizes the right of the owner to exclude others from exercising the owner's property rights. Suppose the land is communally owned. Every person has a right to hunt, till, or mine the land. This form of ownership fails to concentrate the cost associated with any person's exercise of his communal right on that property. If a person seeks to maximize the value of his communal rights, he will tend to overhunt or overwork the land because some of the cost of doing so are borne by others, not by him. The stock of the game, the animals on the land, and the richness of the soil will be diminished too quickly. That's like drinking up that ice cream soda faster than many people would want. If a single person owns the land, he will attempt to maximize its present value. By taking into account alternative future time streams of benefits and costs, and selecting that one which he believes will maximize the present value of his privately owned land rights. In effect, an owner of a private right to use land acts as a broker whose wealth depends on how well he takes into account the competing claims of both the present and the future. The resulting private ownership of land will internalize many of the external costs associated with the communal ownership. For now, an owner, by virtue of his power to exclude others, can generally count on realizing the rewards associated with husbanding the game and increasing the fertility of his land. This concentration of benefits and costs on owners creates incentives to utilize resources more efficiently. You own a house. Do you maintain the house? Do you do a repair on the roof? Why? If it's leaking, why? Because if you do not repair the leak of the house, there'll be damage to the property and yourself inside. And the longer you delay the repairs, the worse the leak and the hole in the roof may become. So you incur present costs to maintain that house which is yours, because by doing so you take into consideration and assure a stream of future benefits that you would not have either at all or not to the same quality if you failed to do so. And what is that? A safe, dry, enjoyable place to live. You have a car. Do you occasionally do an oil change? Give a tune-up? See that the brakes are working in proper order? Of course. Now why? Because if you don't do so, the car will start not working in the most efficient, optimal manner. And eventually, if you don't really take care of the car, it will stop functioning quicker than regular maintenance and repair would have enabled you to do. And by not doing so, you have more sooner than would be necessary an upfront cost of having to buy a new car. In other words, the fact that you can have the stream of benefits from the house, from the car, over a period of time makes you have to take into consideration the importance of incurring costs so the benefit stream can be taken advantage of and enjoyed. If I don't incur those costs now, I don't have the future stream of benefits, or the stream of benefits are for a shorter period of time. The life of the car is shorter. I have to replace it sooner than would otherwise be the case. I don't repair the hole in the roof of my house. Finally, it deteriorates more and the damage is even more to clean up. And then there's the fact that things have resale value. When my wife and I have recently moved to South Carolina, where we're renting somewhere to live right now. But in Michigan, we owned a house. And sometimes you have to do repair and maintenance. And my wife always would talk about this in two contexts. A, well, we better repair it or the roof or the water's going to come in on our head. But she'd also say something else. We need to maintain it and even improve it. Not just because we'll enjoy the maintenance and the improvements ourselves while living in the house. It has resale value. Don't people take into consideration sometimes resale value? The better you maintain the property and the more improvements that you put into it, all other things held given, right? All other things set aside, is it not likely that the house will either maintain the value of what you paid for it or even be greater in the future? Of course. Therefore, in your own self-interest, because you can have the benefits as well as the costs, you care for it and care about its future value as well as its present value and use. All of this is more likely to occur where resources are privately owned. A lot of people worry, for example, about the rainforests of Brazil being overused, being diminished. Now, why is there this concern? I would suggest that the primary reason for this is that the rainforests of Brazil are not private property the way we normally think about private property. You get a lease agreement if you're like a lumbering company, right? You get a lease agreement from the government of Brazil to go into a certain area and to cut down trees. Now, you don't think about, am I over depleting the forest in this lease area that I have? How many trees will be there 100 years from now? Why? Why don't you think about it? Because you've undertaken a lease from the government, and when the lease is up, it might not be extended to you anymore. So your concern is short-sighted rather than long-sighted. Now, what if a portion of that rainforest was yours? Don't you have to think about its future value as a stream of income? If you're specializing in cutting down trees, that's your little corner, your niche in the division of labor. That's your specialization out of which you earn income. What is going to be your future stream of income from selling lumber if you cut down all the trees on your property this year? You have none left over. And therefore, in those instances where there have been private forests, what has always been observed is that you cut down a row of trees to sell as lumber for one use or another this year, but the owner, whether an individual or a corporation, think, what will be the future demand for lumber and therefore wood-based products 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And that will be our source of income looking to the future, right? The forest resale value by selling its products then. And therefore, you cut down a row of trees this year, but if you expect the demand to be equal to or greater in the future, you plant a new row or even 2 rows to replace the one that has been cut down because you're looking to its future stream of revenue as well. Individual self-interest, when costs and benefits are connected in the act, make people take into consideration the consequences both for now and for later. That's why Dempsey's here is saying the landowner is like a broker. He's weighing, what's going to be the gain in the future versus the present, and trying to optimize it in such a way that on net, he's getting the best stream of income looking over a period of time, both closer to the present and further away. That only comes with private ownership of resources. In African countries such as Kenya, elephants are considered the national heritage of the society and are under the control and ownership of the state in national parks in the name of the people. Elephant ivory tusks are highly valued for either artwork, chess pieces, or commercial purposes, piano keyboards, or as aphrodisiacs, potions to enhance sexual drive and abilities, resulting in a highly organized black market trade to obtain them in places like Kenya. Since the elephants belong to all the people, but to no particular individuals, park rangers often find it safer to look the other way and accept bribes when the ivory hunters track down and kill elephants for their ivory in the national parks rather than risk their lives to try to stop the poachers. And since the ivory hunters do not own the elephants and cannot stop other poachers from hunting them down and killing them as common property in the national parks, no one has an incentive to conserve incentive or motive to protect or conserve the elephant herds. As a consequence, we often hear elephants are facing extinction in Africa. Well, there are elephants in India. I never hear about the threat of elephants being extinct in India. Why? In India, it is a common practice to allow elephants to be privately owned and used as a means of carrying tea trunks out of the forest, like the teak forests, for commercial purposes. Private ownership of elephants, and therefore viewing the animal as a valuable private asset, has resulted in no similar threat to the elephant population in India as has happened in parts of Africa. Think of an elephant, if you own it for this type of commercial purpose like they do in India, as like a truck. Truck is the means you use to run your business. You haul things around, you deliver things to your customers, you pick up resources or component parts and take them to your factory to do your production, right? The truck is essential for you to operate your business. To use that car example, don't you maintain your truck? You do the tune-ups, you do the oil changes, you make sure that the brakes are working, the tires are functioning, you put gas in the tank. Why? Because if your truck stops working properly or just dies, how do you do your business? Think of the elephant as like a living truck. You take it into the forest, you cut down the trees, and then the animals help pull out the tree trunks out of the dense forests. Now, given this, there is a self-interest in feeding the elephant, caring for the elephant, housing the elephant. If it gets injured, giving it medical treatment. Because it's your truck. If your truck stops working, you're out of business. And it's costly to buy a new truck, in this case, a new elephant. And therefore, you're not just concerned with just abuse that elephant and get the most out of it today. Because then, if the elephant gets severely injured or is malnutritioned or dies because of your lack of care for it, how do you get the wood out of the forest tomorrow?
I understand also that there is a private farm in Africa for the exploitation of...
Yes, there are parts of Africa I've read about in Zimbabwe where they have private ownership of elephants, and the threat of extinction in that part of Africa is less than in places like Kenya. And they extract the ivory the same way. Yes. Now you see, I have a picture up there of, this is actually a picture of a downed elephant in Africa when the ivory poachers were at it. I did a sanitized picture. They're much more gruesome when you see how mutilated the face of the elephant, the dead elephant, is after the tusk has been removed. I'm being sensitive here. But he's pulling, in India, they're just pulling the logs out of the forest. All of this emphasizes the importance of private property in these cases. Just let me sort of finish here. Questions concerning the use and allocation of scarce resources is always inescapable. What is worth preserving in nature? What are the best means and methods to care for resources? Should we merely maintain what we have, or should we expand its supply? Have we set aside too much and in fact encroached too heavily on the attainment of other ends we also value? One of the vital functions performed by a free market economy is to assist in economizing on and preserving resources that people value and that are limited in supply. Nothing is a stronger force for conservation than the profit motive and the institution of private property. When a person is allowed to own something, he has an incentive to think twice before he wastes or abuses it. If he does waste or abuse what he owns, he directly suffers the cost because he loses the benefit that could have been his if he had only shown more care. And nothing is likely to result in greater abuse and misuse of something than when it is owned by nobody. Even the most ardent environmentalist recognizes that some land also must be used for residential housing, places of work, and non-wildlife recreation. To live, man must grow food, raise animals, and use resources for clothing, the daily amenities of life, as well as resources that go into arts and sciences. The advantage of leaving these problems to the marketplace is that it is then up to the people themselves to decide these issues. People want more wildlife areas for aesthetic appreciation or recreational enjoyment. The greater the demand for these things, as expressed, it should be as expressed in the prices that the consumers are willing to pay, increases the profitability for land and resource owners to use less of what they own for other purposes and instead shift their resources into these more highly valued recreational or wildlife areas. In other words, if there are private parks, private wildlife areas, and people demand these things, and the value of providing it is greater than using the land for something else, get it for what it'll be used for. You can go to the Orlando, Florida area, and there's this thing called Disney World. Now, the land that Disney World sits on could be residential housing. It could be an industrial facility. It could be a shopping mall. Why is it Disney World? Because people enjoy entertainment. They want to see Mickey Mouse. If people value wildlife areas for nature appreciation or natural beauty, and they value it enough, people will see a profit motive to use that land in that ways, for which you'll pay a fee. But nothing is cheap. You're going to pay for it through taxes if it was done by the government, but in this case, you harness self-interest to care for it far more directly. If owners of land and resources most attractive for these wildlife areas fail to do so, they will miss out on the higher income that they could be earning. If an increased demand for housing and arts and crafts brings about an increased rate of deforestation, the remaining forests not yet touched by the wood chopper's axe will rise in price because of its increasing scarcity as we have less of the forest. This creates incentives on the part of forest owners to think ahead and replant trees at a greater rate so that the higher profits can be reaped in the future through harvesting or through other uses valued by consumers of forest-based applications. if urban areas begin to encroach on areas of natural beauty, and if members of the society value them enough to be willing to pay for their preservation, the market will see to it that ownership of these areas passes into the hands of those people, because that is what the greatest monetary return is expected to be. Now, this, on one hand, the logic is there, this frustrates a lot of people. But people won't value it enough. Guess what? Not everybody agrees with what you like. I think that people should be reading more economics books rather than watching television or trashy romance novels. Because I think you'd be more informed, better educated, and see the brilliance of the miracle of the market. Alas, there are many people who don't seem to value economics books the way I do, and therefore they remain ignorant or less informed of this profoundly important social science. You know who you are. Instead, you want to go out and go to a movie, you want to watch some comedy movie with your money, you want to read some trashy romance novel, and you know who you are. Okay? And that, guess what? You spend your money that way, and that's how the resources get used, and not in paying people to write more quality economics books. Damn it. But guess what? People's values are different. People's values are different. And in fact, and unfortunately, some people don't value nature life, wildlife, as much as maybe you do. But you see, if you're going to be so frustrated that you turn to the government, you're basically saying that I am so certain that my values are right, that I'm willing to use the force and power of government through taxation and regulation to impose my values on others in society. Just think of an opposite situation where other people felt so strongly about their values that they were willing to coerce you, even if you thought that what they wanted wasn't worth it or was worth nothing at all. Would you want to be coerced in the opposite way? No. At least in the market, there are potentials for compromise. And what does compromise mean? Well, you know, I'm willing to pay this much to have that much of something. On the other hand, you're willing to pay some other amount to have a certain amount of some other thing. And therefore, the market results in the relative proportions of valuable and competing uses for those resources. Not everybody gets 100% of what they want, but at least the market enables you to persuade others who may share your values to do things to get part of what you want, and you at least follow a crucial moral principle. And what is that moral principle? You do it through reason and persuasion and agreement, and not through the blunt force of the power of the government's gun. Because ultimately, taxes and regulation is the government's gun. Which one of us likes to have a gun put to our head? Okay. Therefore, both morally, in terms of men reasoning rather than using force, and harnessing self-interest through property rights to create incentives for people to conserve and preserve and husband, means that the market system, the capitalist system, is far superior ethically and in terms of efficiency than leaving these things either unsettled or left in the hands of the government. Thank you very much.